Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alana Hackshaw, and I'm an associate clinical professor and the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer here at the School of Public Policy. We are delighted to have you join us today, and we welcome you to the School of Public Policy's Race, Equity, and Public Policy Speaker Series. The School of Public Policy developed this speaker series to strengthen our community's knowledge and understanding about the diverse aspects of and contexts of race, racism, and inequality, and how they shape, create, and define important problems of policy, institutional responses, as well as economic, political, and social outcomes. Additionally, another goal of the speaker series is to encourage all of us to consider how questions of policy about the role of race and racism in societies are debated and critiqued. In line with these goals, we have invited an array of talented scholars from diverse disciplinary perspectives to share their research with us. Today, we are joined by Dr. Niambi Carter, Associate Professor of Political Science at Howard University. We are excited to have her here today and happy that you are all here with us as well. So I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Claire Dunning, Assistant Professor at SPP, to introduce our guest speaker.
Hello, everyone. It's really my honor to introduce Dr. Niambi Carter today to the School of Public Policy, all the more so knowing that she is from PG County. So welcome home and welcome to our school. Dr. Carter is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Howard University and taught previously at Temple and Purdue universities after receiving her doctorate at Duke. Dr. Carter is the author of the award-winning book, American While Black, African Americans, Immigration, and the Limits of Citizenship, which I believe we'll be hearing more about today. And as a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center this year, Dr. Carter is working on a new book manuscript titled Special Procedures, Race, Place, and U.S. Haitian Refugee Policy, 1973 to 2017. Her work on race and policy within the US and through an international framework has appeared in numerous scholarly journals and popular outlets, including most recently a piece in the Washington Post last month on Haitian refugees. Her work has been supported by the National Science Foundation, and she's a lead researcher in the Multiracial Post-Election Survey. I could go on, but will now happily cede the floor to Dr. Carter, so instead of hearing about her, we can begin to learn from her. Dr. Carter, welcome.
Thank you all so much. It is nice to be with you all this afternoon. I spent a lot of time as a high school student. I went to Eleanor Roosevelt at McKeldin Library, so it's nice to be among you all again and to talk about my work today. So I'm going to share my screen here. I think I have that power and get started. So let's see, how do I? Here we go. So the title of my talk today comes from my book, American While Black, African Americans, Immigration, and the Limits of Citizenship. And I'm going to be giving you an overview of the text and talking a bit about sort of my theoretical framing of the issues of the book, and talk in particular about one chapter which uses interview data, to talk about everyday talk and how Black people think about immigration and immigration policy. I'll move to some of my major findings and then outline a bit for you my newest project that I'm working on, and hopefully we'll have enough time for a very robust Q&A. And should I be keeping my own time, or is someone going to keep time for me and give me a 5-minute flash or something? So that we have a lot of time to discuss.
I can do that for you, Dr. Carter.
Thank you so much. So this book really starts in the South with my family. My family is from Warren County, North Carolina, which is a very small place. And this is my favorite uncle. And my uncle is a Vietnam veteran. And when he came back to North Carolina as a child of the Jim Crow South, he was very clear that he wanted to be an entrepreneur. And he started a construction firm, and all of my uncles at some point in time worked for him, as well as other members of our community. My uncle's a brick mason. All of my uncles are skilled tradesmen as brick masons. And he was getting to the end of his career when I was in graduate school, and at a family function, not dissimilar to the one you see portrayed here, my uncle was talking to a friend of his about a contract that he had bid on. He didn't think he would get it. And he didn't think he would get it because he said the firm that he was competing against hired Mexicans. And he didn't say it with any bite in his tone. He was really sort of resigned to the fact that, and I quote, "This is how white people do." Because you have to understand, my uncle was coming from a time and coming from a place, this is Warrenton, just to give you some orientation to the state, it's very north and east, where the capriciousness of white people really could stymie your success. And one of the things that my uncle prided himself on was being able to pay a living wage to those who worked for him. He was paying laborers about $20 an hour. And by the time that he retired, about $25 an hour, which was a lot of money then. And he was competing against firms that were employing immigrant labor and maybe paying around $8 or $9 an hour. And he just couldn't compete. Now, this was only able to happen in a place like North Carolina, where you saw the immigrant population grow by 400% in the decade between 1990 and 2000. And I was really thinking about what he was saying and thinking about how I could talk about what is it that Black people understand about this issue and about this policy domain in a way that did not replicate what I felt were inadequacies in the theorizing about this, if there was any theorizing at all, to be quite frank. And I really thought a lot about Allport's work, where he said, "The same heat that melts the butter hardens the egg." And in some ways, I view Black people's opinions about these policies as the butter. It's very much being formed. And white opinions, to a certain extent, are the egg that are being hardened. And that's borne out by the research. But I didn't want to do a Black American white people comparison. And I'm using that term Black American very deliberately because my work looks only at Black Americans, not necessarily Black people who are immigrant. Because I think it's worth thinking about and talking about how this group of Americans attach to this identity. And I didn't think that white people necessarily made a good foil to do that. And we can talk about that more in Q&A if you'd like. So what do Black people understand about immigration policy is sort of where I started. But the through line of much of my work is how policy creates citizens, and policy makes decisions about who it views as worthy and who it views as unworthy. And with respect to the domain of immigration, my argument is that Black people very much use the issue of immigration as a way to talk about their own impartial incorporation into the body politic, even though they are citizens legally. This administrative designation doesn't necessarily do much to make Black people feel certain about their status in the US. And so immigration is as much about the sort of policy and the issues themselves, but it's also about how Black people understand their relationship to this United States project that we're talking about. So I had several questions here that I was trying to understand in the book. Like many of you, I am a Du Bois fan, and this passage from Souls of Black Folk was really formative for me, not so much because of the double consciousness idea, but because of what that double consciousness said to me or signaled to me as an author, as a researcher, which is the need to sort of decouple Americanness from Blackness. Because citizenship is an administrative construct, but being Black usually negated what the benefits of citizenship could bring you. The vote, for example, the ability to buy a home where you want to travel freely, to travel with the protection of the United States government behind you. And I'm thinking here in particular of like Frederick Douglass, who goes to Ireland at a time when Black people are not even citizens. So he's sort of doing this at a very risky, at a lot of risk to himself, right? So all of the things that make one American, make one a member, Blackness seemed to negate. And so it is from this starting point that I really started thinking about how Black people come to understand their belongingness, right, through immigration policy. So that immigration policy that Black people have a lot of opinions about, and we'll talk about, is not necessarily something that Black people organize around, right? So how do we make sense of some of what I'm talking about and some of the challenges here? So part of the approach to this topic has been taken up by scholars of interminority relations. And those scholars have delineated roughly two, I would say, big ideas about how minorities interact with one another. One is either as coalition partners or as competitors. So the coalition theories largely argue that because of shared minority status, these groups, Blacks and other non-white people, will sort of work together to overcome their exclusion, right? So this might mean coalescing behind a mayoral candidate, or working together to see change on a school board, things of that nature. The other argument was the competition scholars who said, well, it doesn't look like there's enough evidence, right, that these coalitions work. Because if you're looking, say at the Bradley Coalition that was put together in Los Angeles, or you're looking, at some of the work that was done in Elkton, Illinois, these coalitions don't seem to last very long. And so it's most likely that people are actually competing with each other for limited resources, because much of what we want as actors in the political system are finite. And so competition is the most likely kind of posture these groups will take to each other, not coalition. And I appreciate both of these theoretical sort of contributions to the literature, but they weren't helpful for me, in part because of the things that they don't answer or the things that they're silent about. For one, I think the competition school is right, that there are finite resources. But if the competition is built into the process, there is no other way for these people to be but competitive, right? If there's only one city council seat up for grabs, and I think it belongs to my group first, so that we should have the first crack at it, there really is nothing that we can do to share that. Now, that's not about racial animus. That's just about the nature of the good that we are all seeking. In the same way, racial consciousness, or this shared minority status, has to come with something else, right? It's enough to acknowledge, or it's not enough, to acknowledge that you have a minoritized identity and that you share that with others, right? That's one thing. But it's another thing if you actually mobilize that in your politics. And at least from some work from Masawoka and Sanchez, that does not seem to be the case, particularly with newly arrived groups, that it takes a minute for that identity to turn into something political, even if people recognize, yes, we share similar discriminations, right? Likewise, if you are a group like Black Americans, for example, that even though you are not necessarily the largest share of the population, but you have a great degree of social integration, or at least some acknowledgement of the political system, that you are able to wield some power. I mean, Black people have been able to get members of Congress elected and become mayors of major cities. There may not be a reason to coalesce with other groups, even if you recognize that, say, their demographics will overshadow yours at some point, right? They still don't necessarily have the political capital that you do. So joining with others may not necessarily be advantageous to you. And I think part of my frustration with some of these theories is they treat the politics on the ground as if they just happen, as if they just sprung up, and as if these groups just sort of found themselves here. But we know this because we talk about policy here, right? None of this stuff is by happenstance, and it's all on purpose. And so whether we're talking about Warrenton, North Carolina, a small rural town, or we're talking about New York City, right? We know that the politics that whites have wrought really do affect how people encounter each other on the ground. So we made decisions about what the balance of power is going to be in this city, right? We'll just use the city council, for example. The people who come after are going to have to deal with what that looks like. So I suggest that it's important that we bring whites back in, and in particular, accounting of white supremacy. And this is where my theory of conflicted nativism comes in. So one of the things that my work tries to do is understand sort of the longer arc of where Black people find themselves in this particular conversation. And too often, I think we view Black people as sort of triumphant over racism and discrimination. And so they don't have any more problems, right? Because all of the formal barriers to Black exclusion are gone. And while that is true, it doesn't mean that inequality doesn't still exist, right? Whether we look at housing policy, healthcare, transportation, the list goes on and on, right? We know that inequality still exists. But it's a lot easier to make that charge when there's something like Jim Crow in your face. America has been officially colorblind, right, in terms of their approach to these communities for several decades. But we see that there are still a number of gaps in American society that leave Black people, in this case, well outside of the family of citizenship, if we will, right? So because of this, my argument is that Blacks are reasonably skeptical of what these newcomers will mean for their own group's progress. On the other hand, they also believe in self-determination and think that these newcomers have a right to find themselves a better life, right? Even in the US. But there's a lot of uncertainty about how the majority population will use these newcomers, perhaps as a cudgel against Black people and potentially thwart Black progress, right? So ultimately, what Black people do in the issue domain of immigration and around immigration policy is use immigration as a way to talk about their own uncertainties, their own fears about the American project and the ways in which it has left Black people behind and pushes them further down in the racial hierarchy. Right? So that's sort of the framing for this. So as part of an earlier project, I worked on what we call the Race and Nation Survey. And I did this with a colleague of mine, Efren Perez, around 2010. And it was a survey of 2,000 people, 1,000 whites and 1,000 Blacks. And we asked them about different kinds of policy, right? And we asked them where they thought the US government should extend themselves, right? What kinds of policies they thought the US government should pursue. And these are the percentage of people who say strongly agree or disagree. So increased efforts to stop illegal immigration, 89% agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. That unauthorized immigrants should be allowed to gain citizenship. Half agreed that that was true. Increase the wait times to naturalize for legal immigrants, 43% agreed or strongly agreed with that. And then the last one, decrease the annual number of legal immigrants, 57% agreed with that. Now, how do we make sense of this? Right. On the one hand, I think the most basic read would be like, well, looks like Black people don't like immigrants. Right. That's one way to read it. But I didn't necessarily see this in that way, because part of what I wanted to do to make sense of this kind of finding was actually talk to people. So one of the things I did, in addition to using this survey data, was actually talk to Black folks in Durham, North Carolina. Now, Durham, North Carolina is an interesting place. It's where I went and did my graduate work, so I have a lot of affinity for the city. But Durham, North Carolina was a city that was considered fairly prosperous for Black people. There were institutions there like the North Carolina Central University, which is still present. There were two major corporations that were headed by Black people, Mechanics and Farmers Bank and North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. And these employers were extremely important because they gave Black people a place to work that was free of discrimination, quite frankly. And I think an additional wrinkle that makes Durham, North Carolina interesting is that Durham, North Carolina was never covered by the Voting Rights Act because that's how many Black people were actually registered to vote in the city. So Durham, I think, is a really important place to have this conversation. And again, I think it's important to have this or start this conversation in the South, in part because much of the conversation around immigration takes place in large cities like New York or Los Angeles, these traditional receiving contexts. But I'm talking about Black Americans' attitudes about these policies and about these issues. And so the South makes sense because that's actually where most Black people live, right? And I think it's important to remember that. And we can also talk about some of the other historical reasons why I think the South is an important part here. This map of Durham, I'm sure most of you are familiar with these redlining maps that were produced by the Homeowners Loan Corporation program, which really delineated parts of the city as either too risky for mortgage assistance, which are the dark pink areas. And not surprisingly for many, these were areas that had high concentrations of Black residents. But it wasn't just used for telling people where they could buy homes. It was also deciding where green space would go, right? That's why sort of in East Durham, you have these very sort of sparse plantings. And then there are other parts of the city, like near where Duke University is situated, that have these beautiful green spaces, right? Because decisions were made about who was worthy, right? Who was important in the city. So taking off from sort of this scene setting, I guess, for Durham, I think it's important that we think about how people talk about race. And this was really taking up sort of the work of Melissa Harris Perry, who in her pioneering work, Barbershops, Bibles, and BET, talks about everyday talk and what everyday talk can tell us, right? Everyday talk really gives us a sense of people's cultural memory. And cultural memory is distant from people's contemporary or lived lives right now, right? And when we're talking about race, people's reference points may not be their own experience in this time, but may come from parents or others who had an experience and whose memory is maintained through cultural formation, such as texts or monuments or stories, right? And this kind of communication of reciting, practicing and observing this racial knowledge is sort of where I start in this conversation. So in speaking with my respondents, I outlined sort of three big themes, and I'm going to take you through them and use the text from their conversation to show how this matters, right, for how people talk about immigration. So one of the themes that I found when people were talking about immigration, immigrants, was that everything comes back to Black history. Not because all people are Black, but because white supremacy operates to, white supremacy orders the racial hierarchy. And in that hierarchy, Black people are at the bottom. So if you are a newcomer that is not white identified, then you will have an experience that is akin to those of people identified as Black. And so these two sample passages are what my respondents told me. And I think I'm going to read them so I can kind of dissect them. It says, their main goal is to get a better life. A better life does not include looking back in the past saying, what is the basis of this better life? Why do we have this better life? We Black people are a different people, a different culture, a different skin color, and we can't come here. We can't prosper in our own country. So I don't think they care. But since they're allowed to come over here, without having to learn about our history and our culture, then it doesn't matter. They're disinterested. And I think this is important because there's some idea, right, that Black people are the sort of ones who created the possibility for these newcomers to come here. In some ways, that wouldn't be far off, because we get the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act, and the Hart-Celler Act in 1965. And I tend to think of those things as sort of a triumvirate of legislation rather than sort of separate things, right? And so this person is not a learned doctor, doesn't necessarily know about these things, these policies, but is still able to understand that something about the Black struggle lent itself, right, to these other people, these non-Europeans, to be able to come here, but that these people don't see themselves in Black people. And maybe that is because Black people are not able to be as upwardly mobile as some of them may be. Likewise, Brenda is talking about sort of these groups assuming the burdens, right, of being associated with Blackness, right? If they're thinking about taking over the minorities, being the largest minority group, they're going to take on the issues that the minority group deals with. That's racial profiling, that's discrimination. I think ultimately that all the things that are going their way, because I think that the majority race is now seeing them as the new minority, the new Black people. So, they're going to deal, I think, with the same issues that they, i.e. Black people, deal with, right? Which suggests that there's going to be not just sort of this outpouring of support for these communities, but there's going to be a backlash against these communities, right? That as they grow larger, that there's sort of narrative of threat becomes more a part of their experience, and that the majority group, i.e. whites, will treat them similarly, if not the same, right? And this is not suggesting that there's a wish, right, on the part of Black people to see others fail to thrive. But it does mean, to a certain extent, that groups can't simply be self-interested. They have to sort of look at what happened to Black people as instructive, right? The other big idea I saw was this idea that all roads lead to whiteness, right? That if we're going to talk about immigrants and we're going to talk about these racial issues, that you cannot take whites out of the conversation. Because what newcomers may fail to understand, according to Henry, is that when these people come to the United States, they may have an idea that Black people are not what you want to be, and that Black people are at the bottom of the racial hierarchy, and he uses the language of pecking order. And while you may consider yourself superior to Black people, and white people may make you feel comfortable in feeling that level of superiority, you are not going to be white, right? So he says they will go to bat for themselves, of course, or whatever. And they might have their own pecking order in the back of their minds, and they might wait and say, oh, he's Asian, so he's not that bad. Or, so he's Indian, so he's not that bad. But ultimately, he's still an N-word. You're not white. Which may seem a very crass way of saying that people have very clear ideas about what race looks like, and recognize that whites are very clear to protect the boundaries of their own communities in ways that say perhaps Black people can't. And we can talk about what that means. And while these other groups may come here and be considered something better than Black people, they won't be considered whites as far as whites are concerned. And then lastly, one of the big ideas was social mobility, right? So how do Black people understand what their life is going to be like in the face of newcomers, right? And I'll just say in advance that some of what people are saying is not necessarily accurate, right? But it matters that they believe it. And I'll show you what I mean right here. So in this particular interview, the interviewee says they, meaning immigrants, get 7 years without paying taxes. they're able to get more help from social services. I think that not only here in Durham, but the United States caters to foreigners. Now that sounds dangerously close to something that Donald Trump said in 2016 when he was campaigning, right? Try me, that Hillary Clinton wants to give away the country to foreigners. Now it's not true, right? And ultimately is not a persuasive argument for Black people. But the fact that they believe that immigrants are getting incentivized to be in the United States, that immigrants are being allowed opportunities that Black people aren't, is not necessarily hard for these people to believe, because they have a litany, right, of examples of white people behaving badly with respect to Blacks. And so the idea that there's a policy that immigrants pay no taxes does not seem far afield, right? Similarly, Henry says they don't want to understand us as much as we want to understand them, because we want to know, hey, how did you get that store over there? Wow, you know, we would like to get a store. You haven't been here half as long as we have, and you've already got a store. You've already got your own community. You have movie stores, you have clubs. So, and again, this idea that there's something that is happening for immigrants that is not happening to Black people, and that the state is ultimately being, or is assisting, right, in this ability for these groups to be able to have access to capital, et cetera, is still one that exists, even though it, again, is not true. But they don't have another way of explaining how foreign-born people who come here, who live in proximity to them, are able to do things and create businesses and other entrepreneurial activities that they aren't able to do as native-born people. Brenda says, in the US, I feel like there's a sense of resentment that the people that people look at them and say, you know, they're not even from here, and they're coming here and they're getting more than what we have. And, you know, we've been residents of Durham or whatever, or wherever for this amount of time, and they're coming in and almost rising above us. And they don't even speak the language, you know, but yet it still seems that they have more. Again, this idea that Black people can't get ahead because there are these forces that are working against them, right? The state, right, who are allowing people to come in, to use that language, right, and do better than Black people. What is that about? And then lastly, Muhammad, the only thing I would say is that as long as immigrants are coming here, I don't think that it's going to make it better for America in general. If when they come here, they get, you know, more opportunities than the people that are actually from here. Again, trying to marshal their American identity to suggest that they deserve more, but that they won't get more, right? Because they're Black. And white supremacy seems to be the order of the day for this country. So some of my key takeaways in the text and sort of where I think about these things, how are these things happening? That African Americans aren't particularly hostile to immigrants, but they're also not in heavy like with them either. And not because they think that there's something wrong with immigrants, but because they think that there's something wrong with the way that this country functions. I think it's also important to remember that Black people don't really mobilize around the issue of immigration. They have a lot of things to say about it, but it's not a lot that they do about it. They don't call congressmen. They don't write letters. They don't necessarily show up to protest either for or against, right? In numbers. Of course, there are people who do, but this is not an issue that is particularly salient for Black people. But I think that's starting to change. I think immigration policy is part of a Black political agenda, both historically and right now in the present moment. I'll talk a little bit about how I think it is for my current project. And what I mean by that is that Black people often employed, particularly in the 19th century, the language of statelessness and rightlessness and migration to describe their own experiences. And I think if you look closely, what Black people are describing now, right, is a sense that they are alienated, right, from the state in when you look at them relative, right, to newcomers, they even see that more so and being more pronounced, in part because American society, the system, and the policies it promotes are not made for Black people to become upwardly mobile, right? That these beliefs about immigration policy, no taxes, and access to capital to start businesses, et cetera, are there and militate against Black progress, so that this country is not made for Black people to succeed. And lastly, in the words of the late, great Nick Nelson, if you're not talking about white supremacy, then you're not talking about anything. And I think that's important, because when we're talking about policy and the creation of policy, public opinion is a feedback to that, right? Those things are speaking to each other consistently. And what Black people, I think, see with immigration policy is a continuation of a denial and exclusion of their own group concerns. It doesn't mean that America can't do both and, but it does mean that there seems to be less attention, right, to how they are doing as native-born citizens than how newcomers may be. Now, that may not be true, but the fact that people believe it, I think, is important. And I think immigration policy is a way that people see this asymmetry, right, and how they're treated by the state. And I think this is important in this particular moment, because when we're talking about this sort of moment of letting immigrants into the country that were from non-European countries that comes in 1965, we also have this sort of threat narrative. And with that comes restriction. And when you talk about immigration restriction that relies on racist tropes, a la what Donald Trump did last time, it generally does not work well with Black audiences, because their ultimate problem is with white supremacy and the sort of racial hierarchy that it creates, not necessarily with immigrants or immigration policy, right? Because the policy tells us who we are and who can belong and who is important. And immigrants can affirm American choice worthiness as a nation, but who is going to affirm Black choice worthiness as fellow citizens and as participants in the American project? So that concludes this project, and then I'll speak a little bit about sort of my next project. I think I have a few moments to do that. So fortunately, I've been able to become a fellow at the Wilson Center for this year. And yes, we can talk about the problematics of a Woodrow Wilson name, to investigate this project that I've been really sort of obsessed with since, I guess about 2 years ago, APSA. And I was really starting this project trying to understand Shirley Chisholm's policy legacy. Everybody talks about her as a failed presidential candidate, but no one talks about what she actually did while she was in office. And I wanted to change that. So one of the things that I was really interested in was Shirley Chisholm's activism, and along with the Congressional Black Caucus, on behalf of Haitian refugees. And in particular, Shirley Chisholm was taking on the Carter administration and then subsequent administrations about the treatment of Haitian refugees. This is a picture of Haitian refugees at the Chrome detention facility in Miami. But eventually this project morphed, right, into something much larger. These are images from just a month ago, where I had to start really thinking about, what is this project about? And it is trying to, I think, it extends this through line of my work, which is, how does policy create citizens, and how does policy decide who is worthy and valuable of becoming, right? Whose pain is worth validating. And I looked to Haitians because across administrations for the last 40 plus years, Haitians have largely been neglected as a protected class of people. The United States has gone through extraordinary measures to exclude Haitians. So I kind of want to understand what that is, right? But I also want to understand what is sort of Black American investment in Haitian refugees. And part of what I'm arguing about is not just about bringing more justice to international politics, but that they use this sort of Haitian case to really understand their own alienation from the nation state, so that this international incident, this international issue, is really sort of indicative of what is happening with Black Americans at home. So I'm really trying to understand what the Haitian refugee crises, right, because there have been multiple, over the last 50 or so years tells us about Black American alienation, and how American policy on refugees from Haiti really dovetail with sort of what is happening at home with Black Americans, and how they see themselves in that space, and how the Haitian policy is a beacon, right, for Black Americans to understand what is happening or not, right, at home with their community. So I'm going to say thank you. And I guess we're going to open it up for questions now. And I'm looking forward to dialoguing with you all further. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carter. That was fascinating and has me spinning on all sorts of things. I'm sure we're going to start to get a queue building of questions, but giving people a moment to sort of process everything you just left us with. Maybe while the queue builds, I'll ask an opening question just to get us started, and take my prerogative as managing the floor that I get to do so. Your first book came out a couple of years ago, and I'd love to hear briefly what the reception has been like as you've sort of brought this academic text into the world, in terms of who you've been listening to, what it's been like maybe to share these findings with your respondents, or to share them with policymakers, the different identities of groups who've received this book. I'd love to hear sort of what that has been like for you as an author, and as a set of findings that we need to hear really broadly and boldly. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I muted myself trying to keep out the background noise, but thank you for that question, Claire. You know, I think oftentimes we don't get a chance to see our work in real time. And it's been really exhilarating and really fascinating. And I've been able to have conversations with different organizations like ECDC Metro, which is an immigrants' rights group based out of Virginia and working in the area, and just sort of talking with them about some of the work that they're doing in ways that they think my work could be of use to them. That's been great. Being able to talk to a lot of public groups. So I've talked to several organizations that are not academic in nature, because people were trying to understand kind of why this is important for them, right? Why does immigration policy matter to Black people? Why should it be important to them? And I think beyond just the sort of idea that Black communities are diverse. I mean, we live, many of us in this region, so we know a lot of Caribbeans and West Africans and Salvadorans and people who are from sort of mixed status households, right? Maybe one parent is an immigrant, one parent is native born. And I don't know that many people took that in, because Blackness, the way that it's constructed and utilized, I think in a US context, I mean, if we consider it a policy, right? I do, flattens difference in a lot of ways and flattens distinction in a lot of ways. And so it's been really thoughtful for people who've even said, I'm a Black immigrant, but this resonated with me in these ways. And so it's been really great to have a public kind of conversation as this book is. I mean, it's what I wrote this time. I don't know what this book looks like in 4 or 5 years or 10 years, right? When somebody else takes up the mantle and writes some other part of it, right? I mean, if I'm doing it the way that I want to, or if I think I'm doing it correctly, somebody will come out and say, you know, Carter didn't say these things, right? And I'm happy to have those kinds of conversations. So it's been really nice to talk to a variety of groups who've been overwhelmingly very positive, but who've also, made me think a bit more about sort of my own positionality and sort of my thinking about some of these issues.
Thank you for that. Books and ideas have lives beyond what we intend and
Yes.
put out there, and hearing that side of it is wonderful. Dean Orr, please.
Thank you, Dr. Carter. That was fantastic. I usually not like to not take the dean's prerogative to ask an early question, but I couldn't help myself after your presentation. The statement that if you're not talking about white supremacy, you're not talking about anything rings very true. And I'm thinking of what the policy implications of that are when we look at these issues. So for immigration policy, to not pit immigrants and the Black community against each other, you do have to do what you said up front, bring the white dimension into this. What does that look like in a policy context in a place like Prince George's County? I didn't know you were from Prince George's County. That's a real benefit because there are so many issues. Prince George's and Montgomery County, very diverse, very complex relations between the Black community and various immigrant communities. But so often the white community, the white dimension of the issues are not brought into the discussion. So I'm wondering if you could unpack that a little bit in terms of, from a policy perspective, what the implications of your research suggest we should be focusing on the policy side in contexts like those of Prince George's and Montgomery County.
So thank you for that question, Dean Orr. That is a big question, a hard question, but a question I ultimately think is one we're all asking. And I think one of the most basic things when you're thinking about a place like PG County, which is a sanctuary county, I think that's important as a starting point, is that people recognize that even though this is a majority minority county and has for a long time been, people love to say the wealthiest Black county in the country, and that's fraught with all kinds of issues, that it made a decision to be a sanctuary county, and it didn't necessarily have to do that. And I think we need to think about that even with respect to Washington, D.C. Marion Barry made D.C. a sanctuary city in the 1980s. And I don't think we think of sort of Black leaders or Black leadership as sort of being at the forefront of those kinds of movements, but I think it's an important starting point, because I think we should not just assume that people are always enemies. I just think sometimes people don't necessarily understand how they are friends, right? So how their interests converge. And I think part of that as policymakers is we have to be better at framing the policy and showing these points of interest convergence, excuse me. So I brought up, for example, with Haitian refugees, and that's getting more traction now. But one of the things that we need to make people understand is like immigrant detention and criminal justice, and in particular mass incarceration, go together. They're not separate issues. They actually sort of practice with refugees and immigrants first, and it starts to spread with that war on drugs into Black and brown communities. PG County will be one of those places, right? So I think we need to do a better job of that. I think we also need to think when we are making policy, talk to the people who it's going to affect. I don't think we think enough about the people who have to experience or live with our policy, right? We're witnessing that this week with the Metro. So the Metro takes all these trains offline and had not thought about how people were going to experience that commute on Monday morning. And I think oftentimes we make policy and we're meaning to do the right thing. But my work often takes up the policy. Well, when does policy actually create problems, right? When does policy actually create exclusions? Part of the exclusions is that we want to make one size fits all policies, and it's not possible to do that in some cases. And when we're thinking about making things better, well, better for who? And how does this do that? And I think thinking through the end steps by inviting in those communities who are stakeholders are really important. And I think we have to do a lot of the upfront work as policymakers, just like we do as academics, in setting the scene for people so they understand how this thing actually works and understand how this could potentially make things better, and also be willing to listen and understand when we actually make things worse. right? Because sometimes we mean to make things better, Dave Thomas circle, and actually make things more dangerous and more difficult. And it's not always that way, but it is certainly the case that I don't think we spend enough time, like in a county like PG County, explaining to people, well, what does it mean if this is a sanctuary county, right? How does this improve your life and the lives of your neighbors, right? This means that, police officers can't pull you over and ask you what your citizenship status is. And I always like to tell my students, most of the time, none of us have anything on us that could prove that we're citizens anyway, which makes all of us open to those kinds of denigrations and that detention, right? So that's important for you to understand. In the same way, English as a second language education, right? That's a huge issue in the county. And people think, well, if we get more ESL, we can't have this. And it doesn't have to be a either or proposition, but then what would parents like to see? So if we need better counselors and more college counseling and career counseling, then ESL doesn't necessarily have to be detrimental to that end. So how can we achieve both of those things? And it's not always possible, but I think those are small things that we can do. And I would say too, in a county like PG County, if we focus on the least of those, I think that's going to be really important, right? When you look at a community like a Cheverly or Palmer Park or Kentland or Edmonston, right? Those are many of those small places that the county forgets, right? My mom lives in Glenarden. That's where I was raised. That's where my family's from. And if you live below Bright Seat Road, your transportation options are really kind of terrible, right? There are not enough sidewalks. There are not enough safe walking areas. So how do we think about those people and have those people in mind and include them as stakeholders in these things? I think is a really important thing to do in a place like PG County, which is so integral to the state. But I think we focus on the wealth and not enough on the have-nots in these places.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Shanna, please.
Well, your answer to the dean's question, of course, got me very distracted from my original question.
Okay.
So I'm going to try to remind myself of my original question. So I am also from Prince George's County. I also went to Eleanor Roosevelt High School.
Wow.
So just a shout out there to you. That was super exciting to hear. As someone who also just returned to University of Maryland, or just came to University of Maryland, I started this year. So, and a political scientist who studies the intersection of public opinion in Congress. You're really speaking to me here. So I was really excited by your presentation. So thank you. So my question was about whether or not on the book side, on the old research side, whether or not you see the discussions that you heard speaking to citizens, to Black citizens, if you see that translating to elite discussions in Congress or state legislatures, particularly among Black state legislators and Congress people. I'm wondering if you see that that manifesting in the policy debates as they are held in policy forums. And secondly, I was wondering if you see it in policy output, if you are seeing this kind of translate into the actual policies that are being passed.
Well, it's funny you say this. So I've just been spending a lot of time looking at bill introductions around Haitians for the last 40 years. So in some respects, I feel like elite discourse is a lot farther than, say, regular people's discourse. And I just think it's just a function of sort of how elites operate, right? How they have to caucus, how they have to work together. So I think they are, in some ways, more liberal, if we can use that language, than perhaps their constituents may be. And I think in some ways you look at organizations as being the leader in some of this. So whether it's the Congressional Black Caucus, which has been much at the fore of some of these conversations, the NAACP offering amicus curiae briefs, right? And all of these sort of organizations suggesting like, we need to do this. And I think your question fits into the one that Dr. Dietz's question has in the chat, where you see organizations starting to work together, and that sort of brings people in, like regular people, into the process. So in Durham, for example, there was Durham Can, which was sort of a coalition of church organizations and other kinds of nonprofit groups working on behalf of sort of immigrants and Black people and trying to bring them together so they would have conversation. And really the faith-based community was important there. And certainly I think Congress isn't overplaying, like congressional members aren't overplaying their hand. Like Shirley Chisholm certainly was not out of step, I think, with Black people when she was calling President Carter out on his, terms of art by classifying Haitians as economic refugees and not political refugees, right? And about how that was racist and all of that stuff. But it certainly took her leadership and the leadership of the Congressional Black Caucus to get other Black people on board, right? So that you start to see the protests at the Crone Detention Center and other detention centers. You start to see hunger strikes. You start to see college students become active in these arenas. So I really think that the elites sort of lead the charge, and it takes the citizens a minute to sort of catch up. And this is where policy really becomes important, because policy can make attitudes, right? Policy can change attitudes. We saw this like the civil rights legislation, right? So it took the Supreme Court and Congress putting forward this legislation, and then eventually the attitudes caught up to the policy. And I think this is one instance where we see sort of elite signaling and elite policymaking kind of pulling public discourse along with it, right? And I think that's important, right? I think sometimes I think the loop goes one way, right, where it's opinions and then we get policy, but of course we know policy responsiveness is not always a thing. And it can be the other thing, that policy can create the attitude that you want to see that would lend itself to the continuation of said policy. And I think that's what's happening here, at least.
So I'll just wrap up with, yeah, so I mean, that's the argument, in the intergroup contact effect argument is, right, that the civil rights legislation was so critical because it sets a standard for the country, right? It says, hey, being friends is endorsed by the government, and that endorsement is so critical. So I guess my just last follow-up question is, do you see though that there's any like policy areas where there is more coalition, and policy areas where there is more
say you and Dr. Dietz are working together, because I see his question is actually. So yes, so I do think that there are places where you see that. So I think around criminal justice and detention. So the Black Alliance for Just Immigration has been doing some really important and good work in partnering with criminal justice orgs to show sort of Black people, like, this is how immigration, detention, and criminal justice work together, and this is why you should be thinking about these things together. So I think those areas. I also think around education, right? I think there are places where you actually do see some coordination around education, because it's not just about ESL or not, it's about our children getting adequate access to the resources they need to be successful. And so I do think you see some of that in the education space. I also think you see it too in just public services, right? When people are having fits about access to transportation, access to adequate green space, access to clean air, I think you see those spaces. And I'm thinking about my neighborhood in particular. I live in Northeast, where there is an attempt to put more buses, right? And this is totally anecdotal, right? To put more buses in our community. And our neighborhood is already hotter, right, than other parts of the ward. I'm in Ward 5. Our neighborhood already has negative effects to the air, right? The air quality is poor. And I've seen, at least the meetings I've gone to, that there have been a broad group of people who've shown up. And these are not wealthy people, right? These are community people. I mean, I live in Ward 5, which is in this side of the river, the blackest and the poorest, right? On this side of the river. And that is one area where I think you see, I think, a great deal of collaboration. And so those areas, environment, criminal justice, and education, are places where I think you see a lot of movement by people.
I'm deeply impressed that you were able to both give answers, monitor the chat for questions, and listen to questions. Clearly, we're building our skills of Zoom management over the past year.
It's been 2020 for a very long time, Groundhog's Day.
Juan Pablo, please.
I think
Thank you very much.
Oh, I'm
Thank
sorry.
you very much, Dr. Carter, for your presentation. It's really interesting. I have lots of thoughts in my mind. I'm an immigrant from Latin America, so I am kind of in the other side of your survey, let's say, and I think that especially what has been happening in the last 6 years in the U.S. has been very eye-opening in terms of empathy within and between groups. And just to say something, like in the last election, the surprise of the support of like a third of Hispanics for Donald Trump. And I think that the key point there that I like to say is that the percentage of Hispanic voters that face deportation is 0, because by definition, they are all citizens. And it shows how then, after you have become a citizen, or maybe you're of a second generation or whatever it is, you kind of easily lose empathy for issues that even members in your community have. This, besides facts that like Latin American community is so diverse, and we even have people like George Zimmerman, who is a Hispanic. Having said all of that, I am interested in knowing if you have any insights that you gather through this study about going deeper into splitting up these groups, and for example, if you have any insights on the difference between Black Americans' perspective towards legal and illegal immigration, or towards certain groups, and especially if you think that unpacking those differences can be important from a policy perspective.
That's a great question, Juan Pablo. And I think you hit a lot of things, right, about sort of perhaps an empathy gap after people sort of like, I've made it, so to hell with everyone else who didn't. I think that happens. And I've been doing some sort of work around this with colleague Janelle Wong, looking at Black attitudes on immigration and Asian attitudes on immigration. And we found that using the collaborative multiracial post-election survey, that's a lot of data, that Black people tend to be more empathetic than Asians are toward immigrant communities. Why that is, we still have to do a little bit more excavating. But I do think for some people, assimilation means not being the outsider. And the way that you establish your insider status is by excluding others, right, who don't have your status. Even if those people look like you, even if you are ostensibly from the same community, there's certainly, I think, enough evidence that in order to be in, right, as an American, and to sort of distance yourself from being othered, that excluding people that look like you or that may be close to you is a way to go. Trying to approximate whiteness is one way that you can signal that you are an American, right? That you are part of us, right? And it's better to be the us than it is the them, right? Because that kind of othering is really traumatizing. And I understand why some people would say, you know what, it is too hard to be in this group. I really want to be in this group. And I think for the reasons you noticed, right, that people who are identified as Latino in this context can be from anywhere. They can be of any race. And if you can approximate or assimilate or look whiter, or if your name even, right, can be anglicized or sound less foreign, then you may have a better chance. So I think that's part of it. In terms of the legal illegal dichotomy, we actually didn't find a lot of distinction by Black people about whether people were legal or illegal. It didn't really do much for changing their attitudes. I have to admit, I didn't really excavate why. But it does seem, at least, that Black people are sort of egalitarian in their exclusionary practices, right? That the race of immigrant effects don't seem to work quite the same for them as they do for whites. Right? And then when Black people are sort of gauging who they feel closer to, they feel closer to all sort of non-white people than they even do to whites. So there clearly is some sort of shared minority status stuff happening here, but also for Black people, it's just like, you're not from here and we don't really care whether you're legal, illegal, or whether you're from, you know, someplace in Latin America or some part of Asia, right? That they seem to be pretty equal in their attitudes. So I guess in that way, I guess they're fair, right, in the exclusionary practices. But it's also the case that Blacks are not as, they don't necessarily have a chauvinistic orientation to national identity in the same kinds of ways that whites do. And that's from different work I did with my colleague Efren Perez. That piece is in political psychology, where we looked at sort of different kinds of national attachments and how people sort of make those distinctions. And at least from some of his work, there's certainly race of immigrant effects at work, right? Nobody is upset about undocumented Canadians, but people get really upset about undocumented Mexicans. I hope that answered your question.
I'm going to take a couple more questions, but I'm also mindful of the clock. I want to make sure that we give you a proper stop at 1:15 because I know you have other things this afternoon. And it looks like we've touched on the two questions in the chat from Alana and Nathan. So I'm going to take Ebony's question and Mira's at the same time and see if maybe we can bucket the answers to those questions. So Ebony.
Is that me? Yes, sorry about that. I was leaving. I'm actually teaching with Dr. Dunning in just a few moments and want to say thank you as a wonderful prelude to the topic that we are teaching today in our class, which is on immigration policy. So if any of our students are tuned in, they got a wonderful foundation. My family is from Wilmington, North Carolina, so right up the road in New Hanover County, and I'm a proud Aggie, so I just throw that out there.
My niece and my nephew and my sister are Aggies.
You know, I knew it was something. But coming from a family whose grandmother was a domestic, left North Carolina to go to New York. Her sisters were domestics locally. My mother has always shared stories about, you know, going to work, you know, white folks' homes and seeing that type of work as a domestic transfer to many immigrant population. And, you know, you've heard things, you know, Black folk don't want to do that kind of work anymore, you know, but at the same time, as your uncle shared, you know, that's where all the work is going. So sitting in this tension of, you know, Blacks perhaps feeling like we've arrived in some way, that we don't have to do that work anymore, but then also wrestling with the fact that there are opportunities, but we don't necessarily feel we have to take them, and then have the arguments that you heard the participants speak of in Durham. So my question with that background is, has your work been used in sort of best practices, particularly for Black folks, to wrestle with that from an economic standpoint, and feeling as if we too still have a part in this from an entrepreneurial standpoint, one, and then two, in terms of just relationship period, you made a good point about flattening identity, where if you get pulled over by a cop, you know, they're not going to ask, are you West African? Are you Caribbean? They're just going to be like, you're Black, right? So has your work been used in either of those spaces from an economic standpoint, or just from an identity and community perspective, to help build those bridges, as we know those, you know, some of those lines have been broken?
And Mira, can we get your question in and then give Dr. Carter the challenge of answering all of these things at once? So Mira?
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Carter. And unfortunately, my question doesn't overlap too much, so it's okay if you don't get the time to answer it. It was kind of the flip of JP's question, and it touched more on the perceptions of Black immigrants by the Latino community. I'm taking a class on Black and Latino culture, and I'm interested in and honestly kind of disappointed in the traditional immigration rights groups' lack of response to the Haitian migration crisis. And so I'm wondering if your future research will consider the flip side, and or if that's like outside of the scope of what you'll be doing. And thanks for your awesome presentation.
Thank you so much for that thoughtful question, Mira. I hadn't really thought about it in that particular way, quite frankly. I do think it's important to speak back to that community, because I do think the immigrant rights organizations have a bit of blinders, and it really has fallen to sort of Black oriented groups to sort of take up these calls, particularly when people are of African descent, wherever they may be in the diaspora. And I think in part because when we talk about immigration, we have conflated immigration with Spanish speaking countries, right? That we don't even think about all these sort of Black people from other parts of the world who are also trying to get here. And I think, focusing on refugees, at least, and asylees, that's a very particular kind of immigrant. And I think that's where you see a lot of these gaps, quite frankly. So I hadn't quite thought about taking people to task, but, or talking about that part of it, but I do think that's a worthwhile thing to do. Because who people champion also says something, right, about who we think we are. And to Dr. Cooper's question, I feel a lot of sympathies for this because my grandfather was a sharecropper. My grandmother did not work because he did not want her to face indignities of being a Black woman and working in house. So they were poor. And my mother and her siblings had to work in Wilmington in the summers to make money. That's what a lot of people did. And so I would say, the thing that's been really interesting, I guess, so sort of gaslighting of white supremacy again, where people aren't anti-work, right? People aren't lazy, they're anti-exploitation. And that has been perverted, right, into some sort of narrative of, see, these people don't want to work. And that's not true. And I do think Black people have arrived to a certain extent, because what we see is that a lot of these immigrants in the state of North Carolina are taking up jobs in sectors that Black people and white people had left, right? If they're not either doing the labor, there may be being an upper echelon, but in textiles, agriculture, et cetera. And the state, at least, of North Carolina instituted a program. They were trying to get native born people to do farm labor, and they couldn't get anybody to do it of any color, because it's hard work and people don't want to be paid pennies, essentially, for that level of work in the heat in the summer. I mean, the report about it is fascinating. And if you're interested, I can forward it to you. I can't locate it right now. But definitely people have, Black folks in particular, Rebecca Powers' work, I think, is really important here, show that employers didn't even want to hire Black people, right? So Black people were doing some of this agricultural labor. They would, maybe construction got slow, so I'll dip into this pool, I'll do this work for a little bit, and then when work picks up, I'll leave again. These jobs where they could sort of fall in and fall out, crab picking, cucumbers, whatever, those started to be filled permanently. So Black people couldn't dip in and dip out. But part of the reason why that's happened is white employers were making decisions. They did not want to hire Black people because they were going to have to pay them more, and they could not exploit them in the same way as they could undocumented laborers. So I don't know how this work is being used. Quite frankly, I have had conversations with folks at ECDC Metro, which is an organization that focuses on African communities. And one of the things that we have talked about a lot is how do you bridge that gap between African immigrants and Black Americans? Because, I mean, there is a stigma with Black Americans the world over, in the same way that anti-Blackness is a global phenomenon. So when people are just coming to the US, they don't want to be associated with the bad Blacks. Like, that is a thing. And it's not that they're bad people, but they're people who are rightly concerned about what's going to happen to them and what happens to their children, right, if they start to be seen as Black American. And I think, at least there, the conversations I've had, and they haven't been very extensive, at least people were trying to use my work to sort of figure out how to relate to these communities about how Black people end up where they end up, right? How did this all happen? And so that people don't view Black Americans as just sort of lazy people who don't want to work and kind of loaf off the state and don't value education, right? None of those things are true, but it is a very pervasive stereotype that goes all around the world, even to other people of African descent. So at least in that small way, I think that's how my work has been used, at least that I know of. I don't know how other folks are using it.
Dr. Carter, thank you so much. This has been an incredibly robust discussion of both your presentation and sort of engagement with our questions. There's a lot of love in the chat that I'm seeing, so I hope that's catching your eye, just like the questions have been. No, don't feel like you have to respond. But on behalf of the School of Public Policy, thank you for your time, thank you for your scholarship, and thank you for your presence with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for being so engaged and being a great audience and asking me some really tough questions. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much.